We continue our series on prayer, and this morning we come to a passage in 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 1. And as we continue on this series, I wanted to find something that kind of fit this day a little bit, on Mother's Day. So we come to the story of Hannah, and I don't know if you're familiar with the story. Most likely you are. When I read the story of Hannah, it's an incredible story. And one of the things that I think is very significant is the prayer that she prays, which is what we're going to be reading in verse 10 and 11 here. Verse 10 says this, "In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, 'Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head.'" The story of Hannah is, we just see this section. You read this prayer and you're thinking, "Wait, something's going on. There's something that's driving her to kind of make this kind of a prayer." When we see the story of Hannah, I think there is many different aspects. We see pain. You can see the pain right here. You see suffering. You see love. You see hope. But also you see despair. You see devotion, perseverance. Many different aspects to the story of Hannah. And one of the things that we see here is her pain. So what was the source of her pain? And if you look at beginning of chapter 1, at verse 5, we are told that she could not have, or verse 2, we're told that she does not have any children, or she didn't have any children. She was barren, meaning that she could not have kids. Even though she wanted to, she could not have any kids. And that was the source of her pain. So this morning, I want to look at some of the things, highlight how her barrenness caused her pain, how her barrenness affected her in her life. First point is this: Hannah's barrenness was a source of pain and suffering. We see in verse 2, it says that Hannah did not have any kids. Sorry, I'm in the wrong passage here. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none, it says in verse 2. Okay? So we see here that Hannah, one of the two wives of Elkanah, did not have children. She desperately wanted to have children. But verse 5 says this very interesting thing in verse 5. It says that the Lord had closed her womb. The Lord closed her womb. And I don't know if you find it interesting. As I read this, I'm like, the Lord had closed her womb. That the source of her barrenness, the fact that she couldn't have kids, was because the Lord had closed her womb. Meaning, it was nothing that she did. In the New Testament times, when a case like this would happen, or when somebody was born with some kind of an illness or disability, it was the belief that person or the parents had somehow sinned, and therefore it was the cause of their sin or something like that. Sometimes, we see like when women don't have children, sometimes even in the New Testament as well as in the Old Testament, it's almost like, did I do something wrong? Did I do something wrong? Is something wrong with me that I can't have kids? And I don't know if Hannah, I would think she also thought or had those kind of questions entered her mind. But here in verse 5, we're told this: the Lord closed her womb. Hannah did nothing wrong. It wasn't Hannah's fault. But the Lord has simply closed her womb. But we have to ask why. Why did this happen? And the more I study this, which I don't have time to go into, but the more I study the story of Hannah, we see in verse 5 that there was a purpose for why the Lord closed her womb. And I think we begin to see a little bit in verse 10, verse 11. Perhaps the Lord was trying to teach her something. Perhaps He wanted her to really pray more. But He closed the womb. She prayed. He did not answer. That's basically the cycle that we see repeated. But the source of her barrenness was God, as we see here in this verse. And as a result, Hannah suffered. How did she suffer? Well, she was ridiculed and she was teased by the scripture tells us, her rival, which is the other wife. Now, in biblical times, in today, in most circles, one wife, one man, right? You don't get to have more than one. But in biblical times, it was not uncommon for a man to have more than one wife. And this was the case here. Elkanah is the guy. Hannah was his wife. Penina, or Penina, depending on how you pronounce that. Penina was the other wife. She had children. In fact, verse 4 tells us she had many children. It's plural sons, plural daughters. So minimally 4. Possibly more. Hannah did not. And her rival provoked her, meaning, I have kids, you don't. She kind of egged her on constantly. Look at verse 6 and 7. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. She was basically talking trash to her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Exactly what did she say? I don't know. But there's that old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, or words will never hurt me, right? That's what it says. Whoever wrote that was an idiot. That saying, when I was a kid, I remember repeating that. But you know what? Words do more damage, I think. If you get hit with a stick, get a rock thrown at you, that's temporary pain. It'll go away. But words, they remain forever. And I imagine that Hannah was teased. What's wrong with you? How come you can't give Elkanah any sons? Or something like that. She kept on provoking her. She kept on irritating her. To the point that Hannah, she went up to Shiloh to worship. She ended up crying. She ended up not eating, not being able to eat, and really withdrawing from the process. Hannah suffered a great deal. Year after year, it says, multiple years, this was going on. Not having children, you see, not having children was seen or interpreted as some kind of a failure in the Old Testament time. If I say it another way, having children was a sign of success. Okay? For a mother, for a woman, having children was a sign of success. And the opposite, not having, was a sign of failure. Penina was constantly reminding Hannah of her failure as a mom, her failure as a wife. Her barrenness caused her pain and suffering. She was, in our day or modern terminology, she was bullied, basically. Constantly. It was nonstop. Year after year, we're told. Oh, how desperate Hannah was to have a son. Her barrenness was a source of pain and suffering. Her barrenness, Hannah's barrenness, also produced bitterness toward God. In our passage today, it says, in anguish. That's the newer translation of the NIV. And one of the things I've been doing a lot is kind of referencing the old translation of the NIV. I think 2011 or 12, Zondervan decided to do an edit of the Bible, and I told you some of the things that they changed I don't like. Some of the things I think is okay. But here in this passage, we see a difference. So the older translation of verse 10 says, in bitterness of soul. That's what the older translation says. In bitterness of soul, Hannah prayed. That's a more stronger term, I think. And that, I think, reveals a little bit more of what's going on. In anguish, okay, that demonstrates sorrow, pain, or whatever. But in bitterness, that communicates a little bit stronger emotion. Anger, disappointment. In bitterness of soul. Not having children, not being able to have children, it caused her to be bitter. Bitterness starts deep inside the heart. Disappointment plants a seed, and it begins to grow as time goes on. Not getting an answer to prayer is one of the most difficult aspects of prayer, isn't it? We pray, we don't get an answer. But if you look at the flip side, when we have an answer to prayer, what does it usually do? Spur us to pray even more, right? But we always focus on the unanswered prayer. It takes faith to keep praying when there is no answer. How long before we conclude? What's the point? Why should I keep praying? Hannah was bitter, and maybe you can relate to that. It is completely understandable because I think most likely all of us have been there at some point in our life. I am still waiting for answered prayers. There's still things that I am praying for. No answer. There are things that I've prayed for a long time. And I sometimes wonder, should I keep going? Should I keep praying? Hannah experienced years of unanswered prayer. To make matters worse, she was ridiculed, teased, and she was reminded of her failures. Whenever she saw the kids, whenever she interacted with Penina, she felt bad, and that bitterness began to take root. She began to feel the bitterness in her soul. She was disappointed with God. Remember, at the beginning of this series, I listed a bunch of things that are a roadblock to prayer. And I said one of the things I said then was disappointment with God is a roadblock to prayer. Disappointment with God leads you or causes us to not want to pray. When we're disappointed with God, it's hard to pray. When we're disappointed with God, the words don't even come out. You can say you want to pray, but you end up just sitting there because just don't even know what to say. Do you think that she enjoyed going up to Shiloh year after year to worship, to make sacrifices, to pray? And I can't imagine that it was an easy journey. And we're told throughout the story that this happened year after year. They all went up together to worship, to make sacrifices, to pray. Bitterness settled into her heart as time passed, and her prayers went and her prayers, or as her prayers went unanswered. She came hopeful. I think every year she came hopeful that this year, that this time will be different. That she will come, she will pray, and God will grant her request. But each year, each time, she walked away with her deepest needs unmet. Bitterness, disappointment, constantly. That's what she faced. Her barrenness caused bitterness toward God. But one thing that we should highlight here is that she kept going to Shiloh. Yes, she was disappointed, but she kept on going. And I think that's one of the key aspects that I want to highlight today. She kept going to pray. Third thing that resulted from her bitterness or barrenness is her barrenness led her to pray a desperate prayer. This trip to Shiloh was different. She ate. Okay? If you look at verse 9, once when they had finished eating, remember in verse 7, we were told that because she got teased so much, oftentimes she would not be able to eat, or she could not eat. But on this occasion, on this trip, in verse 9, it was different. She ate, then she got up, went to the tabernacle, or to the temple to pray. She got up and went to pray once again for her deepest need. Hannah had reached the lowest point. Her heart ached. It's almost like she had hit rock bottom and she said, you know what? This year, today, I'm going to go to God and I'm just going to pour out my all to Him. And if He answers, great. If not, great. I almost get that sense that that's kind of what's happening here. Because verse 15 tells us that she poured out her soul to the Lord. The interesting interaction between her and Elijah. Elijah was the priest. He was sitting there, and Hannah was praying, but her lips were moving, but she was not able to speak any words. So it was one of those prayers where she's just sitting there in just, as the NIV tells us, in anguish, in bitterness. She sat there, and she was praying, but she was moving her lips. Elijah thought she was drunk. So he rebukes her. Can you imagine if you're sitting in here and trying to pray and someone comes and says, "You're drunk, get up, what are you doing? Get up." You were so offended. Look at the thing, everything that's happened to her. Even when she is pouring out everything, Elijah comes and says, "You drunk woman, what are you doing? Leave your wine," basically is what he says. And she explains to him, no. This is what's been happening in my life. She kind of gives him a summary of what's going on. And she's like, "I'm just pouring out my soul to the Lord." This prayer, this time, it was very different. This trip to Shiloh was different. In her desperation, she makes a vow. And her vow is this. Verse 11, "If you give me a son, I will give him back to you. If you give me a son, I will give him back to you." She didn't just pray, she made this vow to the Lord. One commentator says this was barrenness that would drive Hannah to the kind of desperation few of us have. Hannah was so desperate that she did a remarkable thing. She made a vow to God. If God would give her a son, she would give him back to God all the days of his life. The last part of verse 11 that we read is very interesting. She says this, "No razor will ever be used on his head." Okay, you read that and you're thinking, what is going on? Well, why would she say no razor will be ever used on his head? It seems like Hannah is making what is known as a Nazirite vow. Okay, if you look at Numbers chapter 6, this whole chapter is about this vow of the Nazirite or the Nazirite vow. And there's many different elements of this, but verse 1 and verse 2 basically says this, Numbers chapter 6, verse 1 and 2. "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when either a man or a woman makes a special vow, the vow of a Nazirite, to separate himself to the Lord." And then there's our instructions that followed. Okay? The Hebrew word Nazir simply means to be separated or consecrated. So a Nazirite vow means it's a time of separation or dedication to the Lord. A Nazirite vow, it's time of separation, time of dedication. There are many different elements to the Nazirite vow, and one of those is that no razor would touch the head, meaning that your hair, you would not cut your hair, basically. We remember Samson. He didn't cut his hair, and the source of his strength came from that. But it was not because of the hair, but it was because of the vow and other things that was associated with it. It was voluntary. Men or women could do it. Had a specific beginning and an end. There was a time period. There was no drinking of wine or fermented drinks. You couldn't cut your hair, and also you could not go near dead bodies. That's kind of the outline that we see in number 6. So when Hannah is saying, hey, if you give me a son, I will give him back to you. No razor would touch. So she's kind of saying, I'm going to dedicate him back to you, for you. In a sense, she's saying, I'm going to set him apart for your work. But the traditional Nazareth vow and what Hannah prays, there's one major difference. As we said, the Nazarite vow usually has a beginning and an end, a time period. Hannah says, I will give him back to you for all of his life. And I think it's those words that make this prayer such a significant prayer. Everything that she had wanted, everything that she desired, she was saying, if you give it to me, God, I am going to give it back to you. That was the remarkable aspect of this prayer. Her circumstances led her to make this desperate prayer. But you know what? It wasn't a trick to get what she wanted. She was genuine. She said, if you give it to me, I will give him back to you. And she was very sincere. As we continue the story in chapter 1, the Lord is faithful. She becomes pregnant. She has a son named Samuel. And if you look at the end of chapter 1, verse 27 and 28, it says this. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life, he will be given over to the Lord. When it came time, Hannah got up, took her son Samuel to Eli. And she basically says, hey, you remember me? I was the one that was here a little while ago, and you thought I was drunk. You remember me? So this is what I prayed, and this is what God has done. And now I'm here to give my son to the Lord. Chapter 2, in the beginning of chapter 2, there's joy. Hannah is joyful. Even after she makes this prayer in verse 11, when she leaves, she's happy. She poured out her life before the Lord. She poured out her soul to God. And in the process, all of that bitterness, all of that pain was left. And when she walked away, she said, I have done what I could. Everything is in the Lord's hands. It's just a remarkable story. I have time, so let me share with you this insight. You know Eli, his 2 sons, they were bad. God needed a new leader. But he needed a leader for Israel that was unique. Why did he close the womb? So that's the question I had. So I started researching what's going on. This is what I think happened. Because of Eli's 2 sons were so wicked, God said, there's no way that these 2 can take over. I need a new leader. And I need someone that's going to be able to come and not, if you think about it, Eli's sons were by birth, they were in line, and even if they didn't like it, well, you're next in line. But for someone else to come and be dedicated, there had to be circumstances that were so unique and so special. Enter Hannah. Barrenness. Pain and pain and pain and pain. Year after year after year. She wants to have kids, but God says, I'm not going to. To the point that until she comes to a point, she says, you know what, God? if you just give me this request, I will give my son back to you. God had his next leader for Israel, someone who will follow after Eli. Samuel will become the next leader. You see how God orchestrates things in people's life, in this case in Hannah's life, to bring up the leader for Israel. It cost her a lot of pain. It was not fun for her to go through. But all of that was required for her to get to the point where she can say, if you answer my request, God, I will give him back to you. That's kind of how I think why God closed her womb, to bring her to this place. She kept her word. She gave him to the Lord. When we are faced with unanswered prayer, we could get discouraged and we could give up. Lord knows that there are prayers that I have prayed for in the past, and because I did not receive an answer, I paused or I stopped until I was reminded of something, and then maybe you start up again. But at the beginning, maybe you're very diligent and you're consistent. But as time goes on, the gap widens, lengthens, and before you realize it, you haven't prayed. Unanswered prayer, as difficult as it is not necessarily a bad thing. Let me say that again. Unanswered prayer, as difficult as it is not necessarily a bad thing. Unanswered prayer, there's 2 points here that I want to highlight. Unanswered prayer deepens our faith. When a prayer goes unanswered, could it be because God wants to help us grow? When a prayer goes unanswered, could it be that God has a unique intention behind that? We grow by continuing to pray and not giving up. It tests our faith, but we develop a new level of trust in the Lord. We're able to surrender our will and submit to God's will. We come to a place where we accept that it may not be God's will to answer our prayer. There are times when you pray and you're asking God and He is silent. Maybe you pray and you say, Lord, maybe it's not your will. And I'm okay with that. And at that point, isn't our faith deepened? Aren't we mature? Don't we grow as a result? So you see, unanswered prayer is not necessarily a bad thing. It deepens our faith. Unanswered prayer also teaches us perseverance. If the thing that you are praying for means so much to you, even though there is silence, wouldn't you keep praying for it? I know people who have prayed for salvation or prayed for their family members to have a powerful encounter with Jesus. They prayed forever. Some of them, they share stories about, hey, it happened. Others are still praying. But they mean so much to you that you keep praying. You don't just stop. You don't easily give up. In fact, you pray more diligently, you will pray more fervently for them than you would maybe strangers. Because there's value and there's worth to what you're praying for. Unanswered prayer develops perseverance because we will continue to seek the Lord because of our unmet needs, because of our requests. For Hannah, the unanswered prayer was difficult. It produced pain, bitterness, disappointment. And she got to a point where she prayed this prayer. She poured out her soul to God. I don't know when the last time you poured out your soul to God with a particular thing that you are asking for. She poured out her soul to God. I think the ironic thing is that as she poured out her soul to God, I think this was a type of prayer that she's never prayed before. As a result of that, her prayer was answered. When I was single, I remember married guys used to say certain things to me like, you should fast and pray. I'm like, no, dude, I pray. I'm good. And they used to say that to me a long time. And then I started hearing stories about these guys are like, oh yeah, I fasted and then I prayed and then I met my wife. I was like, huh, interesting. Guess what happened? I fasted, I prayed, I met my wife. It's interesting. When we are at the point, and during that fast, I think I fasted for almost 3 to 4 weeks. I had like lunch usually each day, breakfast and dinner I fasted, and I prayed. My parents would say, or many people would say, I was at a desperate age. They were thinking, you know what, this is it. It's now or never. There were many people who had given up on me, but it's like it was at the last minute. This was the end. And in the time of desperation, you pray. And as you pray, as you pour out your soul to God, God answers. He's faithful. Not just with things that I shared, but when you look at Hannah's prayer in verse 15, she poured out her soul to God. Shortly after, God was faithful. He answered her prayers. Today we see an example where we see Hannah's faith. Her faith grew, result of her perseverance in her prayers. Hannah never gave up, and ultimately the Lord granted her request. As we're talking about prayer, I know that you and I know we have things that we've been praying for a long, long time. Do not give up. Perhaps you need to pour out your soul to God. Really pray. And as you do that, as the Lord has proven to be faithful here, I believe He is faithful. And I believe He will hear your request. And He will answer your request